morning of people out there. This is Jonathan Small hosting actually a special edition of Face to Face. Face to Face is a show that's designed to ask the guests the hard questions and give you, the viewers, the answers and information that you deserve to know. This morning, I have a person that's basically no stranger to the other network that I used to host and produce a talk show on, accesstv.org network, and I have the privilege of having him on WIN Community Television this particular morning. He is retired state senator for Connecticut. He's also a 2018 Republican Connecticut lieutenant governor candidate. He has pretty much a good vast on many different political issues, and he is a good person to contact too. He does a lot of media guest appearances, and he's currently filling in, I believe, on WTIC, the largest radio station in Connecticut. No other than Joe Markley. Good morning, Joe. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Happy to be with you, Jonathan. And I'll do my best. We got a lot of state to cover, and between the two of us, I think we could untangle a little bit of what happened yesterday.
Exactly. Well, I think there was no surprise to be upfront about the election process in the capital city of Hartford, with Aruna Ralapian becoming victorious. Justin Elica in New Haven, I think that was predicted. I think Bridgeport kind of drew a little bit of a surprise with Joe Gannon actually becoming victorious, at least at this particular point, in a very close election. You could almost say like a re-election process. Let's start off, first of all, with Bridgeport. Were you surprised of the outcome yesterday with Joe Gannon actually winning this election?
You know, I wasn't surprised, but I wouldn't have been surprised either way. It was a reasonably close general election. That's what has been happening. Gannon, the last time around, very narrowly won the primary. So that's kind of a 50-50 situation in Bridgeport. His challenger, John Gomes, had the disadvantage of being on an independent line, whereas Gannon had the Democratic line. It's ironic, of course, that once again, Gannon lost on the machines and won because he took the absentee ballots by such a margin. I kind of expect that there wasn't much cheating going on because there's so much attention being paid to it. But it still shows that having an operation behind you. Democratic Party in Bridgeport is a party that can get absentee ballots. It knows who votes by absentee ballots, make sure that those votes come in and so forth. It's a big advantage to have the establishment with you. And that's the lesson. I mean, it's the same lesson in the other cities too, but we can get to that. Now there's going to be a redo of the primary, and next month, as I understand. And if Gannon is defeated in the primary, then I guess they've got to redo the general election. It's a weird situation. I suppose I'd say that if Gannon was going to lose, he would have had more of a chance of losing in the general election than in the Democratic primary, but we'll find out.
So when is the next election process going to take place? Is it going to take place next year or sometime in 2023?
No, they're going to have my understanding is that they're going to do a redo of the Democratic primary next month. That'll be, I assume, a small turnout thing. So it'll depend on who has an operation that can actually get people to the polls, because who's thinking about voting on, December 8th or whenever this is going to take place. And that's where Gannon has an advantage, because he's got kind of the old line political types with him. And I'll say for Gannon, as I would say for some of the other urban politicians. I don't know John Gomes. I knew Marilyn Moore, who ran against Gannon 4 years ago. She was a state senator as well. We served together on a Human Services Committee. I liked Marilyn Moore as a person enormously. I thought there is an honest woman. I could say, if I say a Christian woman, I mean it in the very best sense. Mm-hmm. But I rooted for her, Jonathan, but I also had this question in my mind that if Marilyn ended up, could she run a crazy city like Bridgeport? And I think that sometimes these cities end up choosing people that are operators and maybe even operating a little bit on the wrong side of things. but you've got to have somebody who knows how to handle that urban those interests and the different powers in a city like Bridgeport.
Well, you know, Bridgeport being the largest city in Connecticut, at least in population, and it has a long history of an industrialized city. It has somewhat of a close proximity to New York. First of all, do you think Joe Ganim has done a pretty good job throughout his political career over the last mayoral term and his past mayoral experiences? I mean, what type of job would you kind of say Joe Ganim has actually done as a mayor for Bridgeport?
I don't think he's done much of a job, but
Okay.
I guess I would say I'm not convinced that any of them have done a great job. These are difficult situations to turn around. I mean, to my mind, Luke Bronin in a way is the anti-Joe Ganim, right? Luke Bronin is a smooth, well-educated, and I think honest man, intelligent. I genuinely like him, and he hasn't been able to do anything in Hartford either.
Right.
One thing to keep in mind for Bridgeport, my goodness, if you were to look at a map of the United States and say, where would you like to have a city? Bridgeport is a wonderful spot. It's got a great port. It's right on the rail lines. It's right on a major highway. It's, as you said, it's less than an hour from New York City. It should be a successful city, but it's been losing ground for 50 years or longer, and it hasn't mattered who's been the mayor. Nobody's really been able to turn it around. I would rather see somebody that I have more confidence in his intentions than I do in Joe Ganim, who's to some extent seems to me to be.
Well, do you think any?
Yeah.
Excuse me. Do you think any mayor can really make a big difference in Bridgeport? I mean, when you're dealing with poverty, you know, a perception or a reality of crime, a poor school system, do you think it's really going to be so much on the mayor or like a combination of other factors that you kind of got to connect towards making a bigger difference in Bridgeport?
And the mayor's got the best chance. And I have to say, to bring up somebody who now has become a laughing stock, but at one moment was one of the most popular men in America. I went to school in New York City. I've spent time in New York City all my life. And I saw it kind of going downhill from the 70s into the early 80s, down and down. And when I say downhill, I mean walking around the city, homeless people, crazy people, strung out people, you know, this dirty and disturbing. I reached a point where I thought, I love New York, but I hate to be walking down a sidewalk and seeing people in distress and you know, what do you learn to do? You learn to ignore them. That's kind of terrible. Rudy Giuliani came in, and to my amazement, went a long ways towards restoring order in New York City. And it's since now, if you go down there over the last few years, it's gone back in the other direction. I hesitate now to, I decided at a certain point, I'm not riding the subway anymore with my wife because it's just too crazy. So I think a mayor can make a difference. He needs to be a cheerleader. He needs to have a vision. I think the first thing you do, if I were running for mayor, Bridgeport, New Haven, Hartford, wouldn't matter what city. I'd say public order. We've got to have public safety. People need to be able to sit in their homes in safety and walk the streets in safety. And if that means hiring policemen, that's a good expenditure for the city, because that's nothing else is going to happen. Tourists and jobs are not going to come to a city until people feel they're safe.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about when we get into the capital city in New Haven? Again, as I mentioned, I don't think there was really no surprise on the outcome of Arunan Arulapayan and Justin Elica becoming victorious. Do you see any chance that any of the other candidates had in those two particular cities, or was that pretty much a slam dunk going into the election?
I didn't think there was any chance. I'm friendly with two of the men that were running in Hartford, Stan McCauley and Mike McGarry. Mm-hmm. And I really like them both tremendously. But I couldn't, in all honesty, see where they had a path to victory from where they were. And Arunan, I don't know a lot about him. I don't know that anyone really knows a lot about him. He I think had the blessing of, again, of the powers that be, the establishment. What is that? That's kind of the city employees unions, some of the people, what's left of the leaders of industry in town, kind of the upper crust. Plus, he had a social services background. He was an acceptable candidate. I honestly would say if Luke Bronin couldn't turn it around, I don't think that Arunin is necessarily going to turn it around. But it's just not competitive. Obviously, the Republican Party, good old Mike, who knows more about the city than anyone who's running. It's not like the Republicans even came in second. Stan came in second. Mike was maybe fourth. There isn't really an opposition, and I don't know how you build it. It's going to be that's going to be a long process to try to have a two-party system in Hartford again.
Well, one thing, it's not so much a surprise, but it is troublesome. I think just under 7,000 registered voters voted yesterday in Hartford. I believe maybe out of 60,000 registered voters, could be 80,000, but let's just say at the least it's 60,000, and you only had just under 7,000 registered voters voted yesterday. And it's been a track record over the past 20 years now that you can just see you can have a Hartford mayoral election where under 10,000 registered voters vote. And it's almost like saying the machine, or just that small core base, is winning the election. And I'm good friends with Stan McCauley. I know Mike McGarry. I think Mike McGarry has some excellent views on finance. But the numbers I thought any chance anybody would have had is they would have had to have a large turnout of registered voters to vote. And I don't know if you know the answer, but why is so many registered voters just throwing in a towel, particularly in the capital city, out of all cities?
Well, I think there's a tremendous number of, say, poor people in the cities that feel alienated from the political process. They just don't even see that as something that they're involved with. And, we could say that's a shame and what can we do about it? But it's very difficult to do anything about it. If you could forgive an anecdote, when I ran for the state Senate the first time back in 1984, it's a young man and idealistic in my way. And my Spanish was quite fluent in those days. I had half the city of Waterbury in my district. And I thought, I'm going to go into Waterbury and go into those neighborhoods and talk to people. And, you do it for a few days and you realize that it's like they're so far away from the political process that you'd have to spend an hour with somebody before they really knew what you were talking about. I thought, this isn't working. I got to go to the people that vote, the old Italians in the East End of Waterbury or whatever. It's tough to bring those people out. Though the one thing I'd say, and this is something I said to Stan, is I think Stan's a very thoughtful man, and I like what he says, but I don't know that it doesn't translate into a 30-second ad. And I said, you got to have something, a message that people can say, Stan McCauley, safe streets, or Stan McCauley, school choice, or Stan McCauley, something that I care about. And if you can make that happen, it's possible that some people that have been disenchanted would say, yeah, I want to feel safe again. I'm going to vote for that man. But Stan is very thoughtful and doesn't want to be like the dictator. Stan wants to be the guy that brings everyone together, which is great. But to get attention in an election, you got to come out there and be kind of a strong man. And maybe that'll come along. But right now, I think we got whoever the Democratic Party wants us to have in a city like Hartford.
And again, even when you get into New Haven and Bridgeport, a Republican is very unlikely, if ever, going to win the mayorship in any of those three cities. I can't recall the last Republican mayor. Well, I can recall Ann Usello for Hartford. I can't recall New Haven or Bridgeport. When was the last Republican mayor?
Well, the most recent one is, in fact, I do recall because I knew her. Mary Moran was the Republican mayor of Bridgeport, I think from maybe 89 to 91, one term. And what happens is people get so fed up with somebody that they say, okay, I'm going to vote, I'm going to go ahead and vote Republican because I can't take it anymore. But you're right. In New Haven, the Republicans probably ran the most aggressive campaign they've run for, I mean, 20 years, 30 years. They had a real candidate. He was out there working hard, and they got beat. I actually jotted it down here. New Haven was basically 80-20. So the Democrat down there got even a higher percentage than Arunin did. And Bridgeport, there's still a bit of an active, the Republican Party is almost gone in Hartford, Hartford and New Haven.
Mm-hmm.
In Bridgeport, it's still got some activity. Excuse me, Stan. Excuse me, Jonathan.
Okay.
It's still got some activity, but it's not going to win any elections anytime soon unless people say we got to get rid of the Democrats.
Well, there's a scene like, Connecticut has this factual structure that it's a blue state, heavily Democrat, particularly in your cities now. I mean, the state might be mixed throughout, but when you get into the cities, and it always seems to contribute towards the governor of a Democrat governor mostly winning. Now, you can trace Governor John Rowland and Governor Jody Rell, who basically took over and won. But is the Democratic base so strong in the urban cities that it's going to be very difficult for the Republican base to become victorious in a governorship and to go along with the state legislature, which you definitely has firsthand experience in?
I would say it's like a lot of things. It's difficult, but it's not impossible for the Republicans. They do start out at a disadvantage because I think that the Democrats can count on big margins, tens of thousands of votes in their column out of the major cities. So the Republicans have to do everything right in a way to win. But what I would say is that the Republicans have showed that they've been close. Starting with the 1990 election through the 2018 election, the Republicans either won or they were within maybe 3 percentage points. So those elections were either Republican victories or very narrow Democratic wins. Unfortunately, last year was the first time since 1986 that the Republicans actually got blown out. That on his second time around, Bob Stefanowski lost rather badly to Ned Lamont. And I feel like it's a bad sign. And one of the things I wanted to mention, Jonathan, is I'm not, in some ways, I'm less worried about the cities, which is a problem the Republican Party has had all along, than I am when I see something like the Fairfield or Danbury, but let's say Fairfield in particular, going from the Republicans to the Democrats. That upscale towns like Fairfield, New Canaan, that part of the world, and including up in the northwestern corner, Sharon or Salisbury, those used to be solid Republican towns. In my lifetime, I've seen them go the other way completely. And that's a problem for the Republicans. Where the Republicans are picking up are in cities like Bristol, medium-sized cities, working class cities. It's interesting, and this is part of the Trump phenomena too, that the Republican Party in a way is becoming the party of the blue collar after having always been the party of the white collar.
Well, I think Connecticut, it has the blame game, and we talked about this the last time when you was on accesstv.org studios. The Republicans base will say the Democrats are too far to the left. They want all of the extra taxes. They want, more spending. They want more government involvement. The Democrats will say the Republicans are too far to the right. They don't care about poor people. They don't really show much interest in minority people. They're all about, tax breaks and helping the rich. Is that still going to ever be hard? First of all, is there any truth to those stereotypes or facts? In your opinion, how would you view those assessments when you hear that all the time?
Well, my friend, I agree with it when you're talking about the Democrats, and I disagree when you're talking about the Republicans.
Okay.
But to be a little serious about it, the Republicans have to get out, in my opinion, they got to get a little bit out of this sense of what you're saying, tax cuts and that, and back to what's really behind what's fundamental to that, which is liberty. You know, one of the things that the Republicans want people to make their own choices. They want people, or they should want, they want people to be responsible for their own futures. They want equal opportunity, not government coming in and trying to manipulate things, but saying, listen, we're going to have a fair field, and you're going to rise or fall based on your virtues, on your character, on your intelligence, on your application. And I think that still speaks to people. But when we get into saying, well, we're going to cut taxes more than you're going to cut them, or we want this spending program or that spending program, that's part of it. That's, in a way, that's the application of the principles. But I think we need to talk about principles. I was just saying to a friend of mine last night, in the Republican Party, if you go out as a Republican and say to people, do you think we need more government or less government? Do we need more regulation or less regulation? Do we need higher taxes or lower taxes? I think the Republicans win it if you put it in those terms. And I feel like a lot of Republicans have lost, in this state especially, have kind of lost touch with what the founding vision of the party was. Freedom was the founding vision of the party. I mean, freedom in this particular application of slavery, but also freedom generally for individuals to live their own lives. And I think that's a powerful message. I think that's a message that could bring people to us in the cities as well, rather than trying to outbid the Democrats and saying, you know, we'll give you more or whatever. That shouldn't be what it's about. It should be about what's this country all about? And that's what I like talking.
Well, you know, some people like to say the Democrats and the Republicans just can't work together. You need somewhat of a moderate. And people have said in history, former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, was kind of that moderate, neutral person. He was able to really work with both parties. And people say he really wasn't so far gone to the left as a Democrat, although he technically was a Democratic Speaker of the House, but he seemed to be that kind of neutral ground. I mean, people say we have moderates out there, but I think when you get into the bureaucracy, the money, pointing fingers and blaming, then that's when you get back into blaming the party system. But if you look at the states that they say is doing well throughout our country, North Carolina is, for the second year in a row, is the #1 state for business by CNBC. You have a tremendous business, strong growth in Texas. A lot of businesses and companies and people are moving to Texas. Basically, those are two Republican legislative states, although North Carolina, you have a Democratic governor. Right. And he seems to be, you know, Roy Cooper seems to be working kind of under some tough odds of people in the legislative trying to cut a lot of things that he is fighting for. But is there any facts when you look throughout our country and saying, where is the strength going? Is it more of the Republican states like Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, or does that really doesn't make much of a difference, you know, a party system towards the business growth and population growth?
Well, I mean, that's a kind of laying in a softball for me in a way. I certainly do think that the policies of states like Texas and Florida are the reason that business is booming there. When you say to businesses, you know, we're not going to tax you as high, we're not going to regulate you as tightly, it's going to be easier to open your business and easier to build buildings and all these kinds of things. Well, businesses are going to go there. And of course, the Republicans love to say, you know, where's the problem in America? It's in these big cities that the Democrats have been running forever and forever. You know, it's you can't blame the Republicans for what's happened to the city of Bridgeport because they've hardly had a voice in it. Now, it's not, I don't believe myself it's that simple. Bridgeport is going to be a tough place to turn around, even if Ronald Reagan couldn't necessarily make a difference there. You know, I mean, it's not easy to fix these situations. So I think it's a little unfair to say it's all the Democrats' fault. But I do believe, I'm a Republican because I believe that those kinds of policies, getting government out of the way, are good for people. And Jonathan, I would say too, you know, when you say Who do people care? Do the Republicans care about the poor people? Yes, I think they do. I think we all do, as human beings. I honestly believe that the way to help them, the way to help the people in Hartford is to get businesses in Hartford, get employment in Hartford, get good schools, get safe streets. Those are Republican principles. And that's something too that we can, that I believe that can be worked across the aisle, that you can put a coalition of people together that say, yes, what can we do? We need to improve these schools. Here's a school choice is a bold way to do it, to say, let's let parents make their own decisions about where kids go to school. But I think a coalition can be put together on an issue like that. And it's not necessarily a case of moderating, of splitting the difference. It's I like my principles, and I don't intend to step away from them, but I want to do the best I can to show people why I like them and sell them to people.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joe, you also mentioned something about Danbury, that you wanted to talk about that past election that took place there. What exactly that is happening in Danbury that you kind of want to address?
Well, the only thing I'd say is in terms of changes in this election, what does it portend? The loss of Danbury, which has been was Republican city for 20 years, mainly with Mayor Mark Boughton. That I think is a tough one for Republicans. So to lose Danbury, to lose Fairfield, and there were some others, but Danbury was a good toehold for us. I live in Southington, so I'm right next door to Cheshire, which was part of my state Senate district. And the fact that Republicans got beat in Cheshire this time around. Cheshire, again, has been a solid Republican town for a long, long time. I've seen it. I've kind of known it was slipping away, but it really went away last night. And those sorts of things should be a wake-up call, because we're a weak party in Connecticut, and we can't afford to be losing ground. The good news for Republicans, I think, Jeff Caggiano in Bristol, who's been an excellent mayor, won a big victory, got his whole Republican team in with him. Aaron Stewart again in New Britain, holding that. And those are, by registration, those are strongly Democratic cities. They made a pretty good run in Waterbury too. So that's somewhat encouraging. But of course, losing close is not something you should feel too good about.
Yeah, well, again, I think when you get into the cities, and like you mentioned, Aaron Stewart winning in New Britain, and I think she has done a pretty good job if you look at her record over the past, I believe it's 2 terms. Do they have a 4-year term in New Britain towards their mayorship, or is it a 2-year term?
I'm not sure. I think it's 2 years.
You think it's 2 years? Okay.
I don't know. Again, don't quote. Have your viewers Google it.
Exactly. It's either 2 or 4, one or the other. So to do that. But getting back into just the election results and the process, I'm gonna try to put myself into the people that didn't vote.
Yeah.
I'm a registered voter, but I did vote. So I'm not putting myself directly. I'm just using this hypothetically, because I am a registered voter and I always vote. But for the people that just said, I'm not going to vote, and the numbers, particularly in the capital city, was dismal, they could say, well, look, every year we have, well, not every year, but every 4 years we have this mayoral election. We have these candidates coming, making assessments and what they need to do and why they should become the mayor or the city council, but particularly the mayor. I'm watching my city every single day run down to the ground. Public safety, crime is really high. The school system hasn't really done anything dramatically. The quality of life issues, I feel like I'm being taken for granted. And whether I vote or don't vote, I'm still going to be living in some bad areas of the city. I'm still going to be subjected to a lot of problems that I don't want to deal with. And why now, all of a sudden, 4 years later, should I just cast my vote for someone that I personally don't believe is capable or gonna make any difference? I think I'm just using that assessment as one example why people might say, I'm just not gonna waste my time going out there and voting. Or do you think is it anything truth towards that, Joe, or is it there a lot more to it than just that? Why people are
No,
not
I
voting?
think you got it. I think that what you just expressed is exactly what a lot of people feel. And I think they feel like, what do I care between a couple of politicians that don't care about me, right?
Mhm.
Why should I bother supporting one of them or the other? Nothing's going to change. And the answer to that, um, again, I think it's not really this is not an ideological or even a partisan answer. I think part of the answer to that is a kind of a charisma. You need
Mhm.
to have a candidate that spends time in those communities and that can make a connection with those people. That they say, hey, that guy is trying, and he came before the election, but now that he's mayor, he's back again after the election, and
Mhm.
he's not just. To go back to Luke Broden, who, as I said, I think Luke Broden is an exceptional man in many ways, but he's not a backslapper. He's not a man that walks into a room and gets everybody excited. You'd almost need that combination. You need somebody with his intelligence and I think his desire to do the right thing, but who also had the kind of outsized personality to come in and make people feel like he cares about them. I've seen that in people. I think one of the best examples we had of that in Connecticut, the flawed man in many ways, but John Rowland, who could work a room, who could go in
Mhm.
and leave people with the impression that he understood them and that he cared about them. And I think Giuliani somehow, when he was mayor of New York, was able to convey that the average New Yorker somehow cared about him and felt invested in Rudy Giuliani. I don't think anyone felt particularly invested in Luke Broden or Justin Elicker. Um, that you say, okay, this guy he's smart, he's a technocrat, he maybe knows how to do things, but to really say I'm putting my faith in that. You need to find somebody like that, and I haven't seen too many of them show up. Mark
So
Boughton
this,
did it in Danbury. I have to say, I think Mark Boughton, I think, had a connection with people in Danbury.
mhm. Do you think race played any role or plays any role? I mean, when you look at the cities and particular, when you say, I've heard throughout this past campaign, and I'm not going to point fingers and directly say who said it, but you'll hear some sound bites of people saying, well, cities are black and brown people. We should have a black person representing the city. And Hartford hasn't had technically, although this person, Arun Araplian, might be classified as a black person or minority, but you'll hear that Hartford hasn't had a black mayor since Carrie Saxon Perry in 1993. New Haven has had a black mayor with Tony Harp. I don't recall Bridgeport. Um, and then some people will say, well, if you go to your surrounding suburbs like West Hartford, you always see the political system representing the majority of the population. So can race be an issue when you're having a political campaign and you're running a race and then you have some candidates trying to convince people to vote for a person that has the same race and understandings of racial issues that they have, or should that pretty much be thrown off of the table and look at the right and best candidate?
I think as a practical matter in running a campaign, of course you're going to think about race and about people's identification. Let's call them if let's call them tribal identities, right? Whether you're
Mm-hmm.
black or Hispanic or Italian or Jewish, whether you're a Catholic, and that even goes into issues to some extent too. Of course, you have to think about that. And if I were I am a real white bread guy. I got no group to reach out to. I'm Irish, German, whatever. So it's not like there's some enclave. But if for instance I were an Italian or Polish, where there still is an identifiable community, I'd try to take advantage of that. I mean, I wouldn't do it in a negative way,
Mm-hmm.
but I can imagine you could do anything now with computer lists and say, give me the Italian surnames and let me send a letter out to those people telling them what my Italian heritage means to me. I don't think that's illegitimate. It may not be the highest level of political discourse, but I think it's a reasonable thing to do. I'd love to see a leader emerge. I mean, and Stan is the kind of guy, and maybe Jonathan, maybe you're the kind of guy, but I mean, that could come out of the Black community in a city like Hartford and that not just say, vote for me because I'm one of you,
Right.
but say, come together with me and let's get this job done. And here's my vision. And I think that potential exists. I wouldn't, to win just because you're of one race or another race doesn't solve the problems. But if the right man or the right woman came along, and I knew both Carrie Saxon Perry and Thurman Milner a little bit from my first time around in politics. And Carrie Saxon Perry was a dear woman, but just not the person that was going to be able to do that. It needs to be a dynamic character and somebody with force. But yeah, you've got to be honest about race. You got to be honest about your district when you get into politics. Who's there? Who could potentially vote for me? As Stan and I talked about that, to say there's buckets of votes. There's people on this issue. There's people in this neighborhood that if you can connect with these individual groups, you start to put together a coalition. And somebody wants to do that, get started today. Build it for 4 years.
Well, I mean, truthfully, I was a little surprised in the Hartford Democratic primary. I thought Senator John Fonfara was going to win. I mean, I was not shocked, but I was surprised. And I was endorsing J. Stan McCauley for mayor. He's a good friend of mine. I was part of his network, and I do believe he is the best candidate to serve the city of Hartford. But if he was not in the particular race, I had no problems with Senator John Fonfara. Now, I know you met him and you probably had some interaction with him in the state legislature. And I would say at the very least, if Senator Fonfara was doing things going into the mayoral race just to get elected, at the very least he's doing something. I would rather have someone doing something for political gain, as ugly as that may sound, than just not doing anything and then seeming like they can take your vote for granted. I mean, people will say politics has come down to you do something for me, I do something for you. You want my vote, then you have to do this. So for me personally, I didn't look at the race issue like I heard some people was talking about, underneath the surface. But how would you say, I mean, what happened with Senator John Fonfara? Do you think, how did he end up losing this primary, in your opinion?
Well, John Fonfara is a very effective legislator. And I knew him reasonably well, and I had my good days with him and my bad days, but I don't say that with any hard feelings towards him, which I don't have. He was, if I say he was an operator, I don't necessarily mean that as a pejorative. It's a good thing to be able to be, but that doesn't necessarily translate to popular support. What it translated to in his case was a lot of money. But you're in an election with such low turnout that if you end up with a big pile of money and you say, oh boy, I'm going to spend this on media, on radio and TV and mail to everybody in the city, you're wasting so much of it because you're really fighting over just a few thousand people that are going to show up in that election. And Fonfara is he's a cool customer, let's say. I was talking about people that can walk into a room and turn people on. I wouldn't put him in that category. I wouldn't put myself in that category either. So it's not to take anything away from him. But I wasn't surprised that he lost. I was if there was somebody that I thought could have emerged, it was Eric Coleman, who I thought has a little bit more of that charisma. I don't really understand what happened in that primary. It's the voting turnout is so low. I would put all my money into IDing who's likely to vote or who can I get to vote because I got some connection with them. And then I think I'd spend the day, I'd hire a fleet of limousines and drive them to the polls. I mean, It's just a matter of turnout, and obviously Arunin, I think, have the institutional support, which, just like Ganem in Bridgeport, ends up being the turnout support in the absentee ballot operation and so forth.
Well, I'm going to give one last assessment because we're running out of time. I mean, towards the end, there was some, I don't say speculation, but some people were in the Hartford mayoral race were saying that the other candidates like Stan McCauley, Mike McGarry, Giselle Jacobs, and I guess Nick LeBron was also in the case, that the 3 out of the 4 should just drop out of the race and back one particular candidate. And I was hearing Nick LeBron was the one that they felt they should have backed, and he would have probably had a better chance, because it seemed like, to me, it was almost like now people in the city, particularly of Hartford, was saying, we just don't need Arunin. Even successful as Arunin was leading in the polls and how he was favored, people just felt like, he didn't show up to certain debates, and it's almost like he was just taking the city for granted. And even if the 3 out of 4 candidates would have dropped out, I got to hear that would have calculated to about 2,078 votes that went between the 4 candidates, and Arunin would have still had the majority because he had 4,701. So sometimes people will say candidates should just drop out and try to back one candidate that has the best chance of winning. Is it that simple in the last assessment towards we ending this program? In your
It's not that simple, and there's 2 big reasons for it. And number one is that votes are not that transferable. So even if everyone walked out and had the press conference and said, we're getting behind LeBron, I mean, maybe half of the people that were voting for Stan would go over, but a lot of them would go to Arunin, and it's the same thing we got right now with Trump and the Republicans. The people that don't want Trump say, oh, if only we could get DeSantis and Haley and everybody. Well, if DeSantis drops out, half of his people are going to go to Trump. It doesn't matter what DeSantis says. And the other problem is, how do you get 5 people that want something in a room together to say 4 of us are going to give it up and he gets it? It's just about impossible.
Exactly. Well, I wanted to hear you make the final assessment and clarify that, as a person that is a former state senator and a legislator. You are, I guess, a Republican nominee for lieutenant governor in Connecticut. So you know firsthand the whole political process of running a campaign and being involved and really what's at stake. And unfortunately, we're out of time, but it was a pleasure having you on this particular program of Face to Face. If there's any last words you want to leave us off towards as we end this particular program, feel free to do so.
Yeah, just say one thing. If you want anybody who's listening to this who wants to make a change, get involved, and get involved with a party, get involved in the community, but figure out what this process is about and jump into it. And Jonathan, let me just say, thanks for inviting me. I enjoy it just from the point of view of sitting and talking to you for 45 minutes. It's a pleasure.
Exactly. And it was my pleasure too. I mean, you're one of the best. And hopefully I can tune into you later this afternoon on WTIC radio if you're going to still be on.
No, by 2 days. I did yesterday and today, but I don't know when I'll be back. But Todd Feinberg's back in that spot today.
Okay. Well, you did an excellent job, and I appreciate you being available under short notice. And I'm pretty sure we'll definitely speak again in the very near future. Thank you.
I'll look forward to it.
Okay. Likewise. Okay, this is Jonathan Small, just ending this edition of Face to Face. And until next week, I look forward to seeing you again as well. Thank you.